Today we're going to learn how to factor by grouping. Here is our first question, and we're going to factor by grouping. Now, how do you know when to use factoring by grouping? Well, if you have 4 terms and none of them have a greatest common factor, that's when you use it. Now let's look at our examples. We have 4 terms right here. And let's look at the coefficients. We've got 3, 6, 4, and 8. Now, there's no common factor other than 1. So really, there's no greatest common factor other than 1. So in this case, you would use factoring by grouping. Now that we know that, let's get on to factoring. So as the name suggests, you are going to group 2 terms together. So I'm going to group these 2, and I'm going to group these 2 to do factoring by grouping. Now, you can also do other terms. So for example, you can group 3x squared and 4x. So we've grouped those 2 together. Or 6x plus. So you're basically grouping 2 at a time. Okay, now let's get back to the original one. So I'm actually going to group these 2 together. Now I'm going to find the greatest common factor between the 2. So let's look at the 3 and the 6. The greatest number that can be divided into both of them would have to be 3. Okay, now notice both of the terms also have an x. So you're going to have an x in your greatest common factor. And you take the one with the smallest exponent, which happens to be just the plain x. Okay, so let's put that beside the 3. So our greatest common factor is 3x. Next, put a bracket, and we're going to divide both of the terms by 3x. So let's start the first one. 3x squared divided by 3x is x. Okay, let's do the second. 6x divided by 3x, that comes to positive 2. Okay, now we close the bracket. Now let's move on to the other grouping. So we are going to group the 4x and the 8, and let's find the greatest common factor. But notice beside the 4, you've got a positive sign. So we're going to put the positive right here. Okay, now let's find the greatest common factor. We've got 4 and 8. So number that can be divided into 4 and 8 without giving a decimal, and the biggest number would happen to be 4. Now let's look at the variables. There's an x here, but this one has no x, so we cannot take the x out. So 4 is our greatest common factor. Okay, let's draw the bracket. And now we're going to divide both of the terms by 4. So 4x divided by 4, that's x. And then positive 8 divided by 4 happens to be positive 2. Now close the bracket. Now look what we have here. We've actually seen this before, and we're going to do binomial factoring. So how do we do that again? Well, notice the 2 terms, this term and that term, they both have a common factor. And that common factor happens to be x plus 2 inside the bracket. So we're going to take out that common factor. So let's write the equal sign and let's put x plus 2 because that's the common factor. We're going to take that out. Now what's left over? We've got the 3x and the positive 4. So now you're going to take these 2 and you're going to put that into a separate bracket. So let's do that. So 3x plus 4, close the bracket. And this right here happens to be your final answer. For our next question, you can actually take the 2x squared plus 6x and negative x minus 3 and pair those together. But I'm going to do something different, just so you can see that there's a different way of doing this as well. I'm going to pair the 2x squared with the negative x. So 2x squared minus x. Okay, now I'm going to pair the 6x with the negative 3. So let's write that. Positive 6x, negative 3. So see, the pairings are different, but as long as you have pairs. Okay, so now I'm going to focus on the first pair, 2x squared minus x. Let's look for a greatest common factor. So we've got 2 and we've got a 1 in front of the x. There's no greatest common factor other than 1. So now let's move on to the x's. Both of them have an x, and you're going to take the x with the smallest exponent, which is just the plain x. So let's write that down. So our greatest common factor is x. Okay, now we're going to divide both of the terms by the x. So let's do the first one. 2x squared divided by x is just 2x. Okay, on to the next one. So negative x divided by x. Well, that happens to be just a negative 1. Now let's close the bracket. Now let's move on to the second pair. 6x minus 3. Notice there's a positive on the left side of the 6, so I'm just going to pull that out. Okay, now let's find the greatest common factor between the 6 and the 3. So a number that can be divided into both without giving a decimal, and that biggest number would be 3. Now let's look at the variables. You have an x here, but there's no x in the second one. So we cannot take x in our greatest common factor. So 3 is it. Now let's divide both by the 3. So let's do 6x divided by 3, and that comes to 2x. And now let's do the second one. Negative 3 divided by 3 comes to negative 1. Once again, if you look at what we have, we are actually now going to factor by using the factoring binomials. So both of them have a common factor of 2x minus 1. So let's factor that out. So in a bracket, we're going to write 2x minus 1 and close the bracket. Now what's left over? The x and the positive 3. So those two are going to go into a separate bracket. So x plus 3. Okay, close the bracket. And this right here happens to be our final answer. On to our last question. So this time I'm going to pair these two together. So let's start off by finding a greatest common factor for 90 and 36. Now 9 can go into both of them, but there's a bigger number, and that bigger number is actually 18. Okay, now notice both of the terms actually have an a, so you're going to have to take out the a because that's a common factor. Now notice we've got u in one and we've got v in one. Those are different, so you cannot take that out because they're not common for both. Okay, so we've got our greatest common factor. Now let's divide both terms by 18a. So let's start off with the first one. Okay, 90 divided by 18, that comes to 5. And then let's do a divided by a, that comes to 1. You don't have to write the 1 beside the 5, but there's a u, you have to write that down. Now let's move on to the next one. Negative 36 divided by 18a. Well, negative 36 divided by 18, that comes to negative 2. Now a divided by a, that comes to 1. But again, you don't have to write the 1 beside the 2. But because there is a v and nothing else, you have to write down the v. Okay, let's close the bracket. Now let's move on to the other two terms. Now notice on the left side of 150, there's a negative, so I'm going to pull that out and put that here. Now let's look at 150, and then let's look at the 60 and try to find a greatest common factor. So the biggest number that can be divided by both without giving a decimal is actually 30. Now both also have a y, so that's a common factor. So you're going to take out the y. And the other two, well, we've got a u and a v. They're not the same, so you cannot take that as a common factor. Okay, we have our greatest common factor. Now draw a bracket, and we're going to divide each of them by negative 30y. So let's do the first one, negative 30y. Now negative 150 divided by negative 30 will be a positive number, and that's positive 5. And y divided by y is going to be 1, so you don't have to write that part down. But because there's the u by itself, you're going to have to write down the u. All right, let's move on to the next one. So positive 60 divided by negative 30. That's going to be negative 2. And next one we have y divided by y. Again is 1. You don't have to write that beside the 2. But because there's a v by itself, you have to write that down. Okay, close the bracket. Now once again, we are going to do factoring a binomial because both of these have a common factor of 5u minus 2v. So let's factor that out and put that in a bracket. Now the leftovers happen to be 18a and negative 30y. So we're going to put that into a separate bracket and close the bracket, and this happens to be our final answer.